So first of all, thanks to UCD and the National Library for this generous invitation to partake in what I already can see is a wonderful dialogical experience in this exquisite room. What could be a more fantastic venue for this event? Very well chosen. It's also wonderful to be back in Dublin. I've been here before in the summer, and it's very nice to be reminded that another island like my own country, very much dominated by the coastal tides and the coastal weather, can be anything from snow and sleet to high skies in March. So I'm sure you can prepare for St. Patrick's Day in that vein. We already heard this afternoon is going to be quite comprehensive in terms of themes to be taken up. So I was a bit kind of humbled and a bit cautious when accepting Margaret's generous invitation, because I thought, what can I contribute in this wide-ranging thing? So what I've attempted to do is what most of my students tend to do when they don't know what the professor's assignment was really about. I made my own interpretation. So I'll try to address, within the brief space that each of us have got here, three key questions: what are museums for, and what are museums about, and how can we collaborate in these cross-pollinating networks that we find ourselves in today. But first of all, let me start by a very standard definition about who are museums for, because I think that is a kind of key question resonating also in this morning's very interesting discussions and interventions. And if we start by seeing the kind of standard definition from ICOM, International Council of Museums, on their website, it says a museum is a non-profit permanent institution in the service of society and its development, open to public, which acquires, conserves, researches, communicates and exhibits the tangible and intangible heritage of humanity and its environments for the purpose of education, study and enjoyment. This is the standard definition of what a museum is and who museums are for. It's a non-profit institution in the service of society, and it has a number of kind of standard obligations to fulfill. And I'm sure you can recognize the kind of common understanding of who a museum is for. It's for in the service of society, but it's very much you could say a definition of a museum that has its focus and its starting point in that a museum's rationale and kind of identity stems from its particular collections. This is the rationale for the museum being in the world, and also the kind of starting point for who the museum could be for. And that is a kind of definition that we have had over a number of years, particularly in Europe, and I include in the EU, or grander Europe, I could say, where public funding has been underpinning museums for almost 200 years in many cases. So in this thing about in the service of society is very important, but also this notion that the reason we have museums is because we have particular collections, we have a particular cultural heritage that we want to preserve, and also often because it's publicly funded, it's often through tax money, so taxpayers should sort of get their money back in a sense by being invited in to take part of these wonderful collections and partake in our cultural heritage. But in recent years we've seen a different definition of what museums, who museums are for, and I'll just flag up two publications which I'm sure are familiar to many of you in the room. One is from the Dutch Museum Association. It's called More Than Worth It, and it came out in 2011. And in small, it's trying to go beyond a kind of standard definition of who museums are for. And in small print up here, I've just printed out the front page, you can see that it lists 5 kind of missions, or 5 kinds of elements that the museum should give back to society, which is, it has collection value, it has connecting value, it has educational value, experience value, and economic value. So there you begin to see a discussion about a different take on museums, in the sense that museums are not necessarily defined through their collections, but more defined in terms of what they give back to society, or how they interact with society in more general terms. And 2 years later, the UK Museums Association went even further in terms in this line of thinking with the publication Museums Change Lives. And as you can see here, it says, museums change people's lives. They enrich the lives of individuals, contribute to strong and resilient communities, and help create a fair and just society. Museums, in turn, are immensely enriched by the skills and creativity of their public. So here we have a much more, you could say, context focus about who museums are for. Museums are not just for preserving and exhibiting collections, but they're much more for engaging with society through their collections. So where ICOM's definition is kind of focused on the collections themselves as an end of the kind of the end rationale of what museums are for, then you can see that with these new types of publications, you see a new type of discourse that see collections more as a means to an end, and the end is more engagement with society, it's more interaction with society, it's to do with ways in which the museum can give something back to society. And of course, those 2 definitions, those 2 understandings of what museums are for, coexist today. And I think what is important to stress here, that the majority of museums, in a very inclusive sense of the word, try to juggle those different understandings in their everyday practice. And I'll just give you one example of how that can play out. But I think it's before giving you the example, I think we just need to. This you can't even see this picture there. I'll talk to you about what it says. But anyway, I think the second aspect that I wanted to take up is, what are museums about? So if you go further with the notion taken from Museums Association and also from the Dutch Museum Association, you can see that museums, and maybe have always been about relations. They're not so much about collections as they're about relations with the surrounding society, and that can be interpreted in different ways. If you have a collection focus, you'll start with the collections and the professionals who curate the exhibitions and do research about the collections, and then engage through that with the public. If you have a context focus, you often start with what is it we want to engage with in terms of the public, and then you bring in professionals and collections and exhibitions. But I mean, the beginning and the end is more, in what ways do we want to have a dialogue with the public? Also, as we heard this morning from the Science Museum, that's very much along the lines of the context focus. The little dark picture that you can't see, I took with my own mobile phone a couple of years ago outside the Natural History Museum in London at midterm break, where it says, "You're now 45 minutes from dinosaurs." And this is because in some of the big national museums, and we also heard some examples this morning about how queuing up, very far around the corner, big national museums can still attract large numbers of audiences and visitors through a collection focus, because they have, for a number of reasons, either wonderful collections or they have a kind of public presence, so they can still go by the collection focus rationale. but others are in a different position and they need to reach out to the public in different ways. And here I think communication and interaction come into play. And I want to flag up two trends that I think we need to take account of. One is what I'd call the participatory turn, and the participatory turn has nothing to do with what I'll talk about in a minute, the digital turn, because participation and interacting with the public is a kind of discourse that has been around at least since the 80s and maybe even before. So it's in a sense to draw on the notion of having an engagement with the public in a particular sense, where you think in terms of the public as being your main rationale for being in the world. But very importantly, the public is often defined in two very different terms, and we also heard reference to this in one of the morning's presentations. Either the public is defined in terms of being consumers on a market, and museums have to compete in the experience economy with lots of other often urban attractions, and they have to compete on the same level with getting as many people inside the door as possible. The other notion of public is what resonates more with the kind of standard understanding of what museum is. It's publicly funded, and it understands the public and the visitors as citizens, and as citizens in a society where museums and cultural heritage are positioned in the world to help citizens understand themselves and the world better than they did before they entered the museum. This participatory turn has now been, you could say, radicalized in the sense that we have also seen a digital turn, in the sense that, of course, museums have always used media. I mean, signage is a medium. We have always seen media being used in museums, but the way in which we have new digital media for communication and interaction kind of radicalizes the participatory turn, in the sense that you can now very easily engage with types of public, types of audiences that are not physical visitors to your museum. So the museum has a digital presence as well as a physical presence. The pause between physicality and virtuality becomes more impermeable or more permeable, and that means that the museum has to take into account not only defining visitors who come in the door, but also visitors who might never visit the museum. So this kind of more hybrid space and hybrid time is becoming very important. These types of trends and these dual notions of what a museum is for and who a museum is for, as I said before, is something that most museums today in their everyday practice try to juggle. And I have had the good fortune in DREAM to collaborate over the last 6-7 years with a number of primarily Danish museums, and we have collaborated, and we do collaborate with, to the left here, a number of art museums and galleries, in the middle a number of cultural history museums, and to the right a number of science and experience centres. So we have a very inclusive definition of what a museum is and could be, and we have had a particular take on ways in which digital media can help engage learning in museums in more creative ways. I'm not going to speak about creativity and learning for you, but I'm going to draw on these forms of collaboration in what I want to address, because time is limited, as a kind of one particular way in which a museum can juggle these two discourses of what a museum is, either the collection focus or the context focus. The collection focus gives you a kind of very defined identity, but also an identity that many people, many visitors can have difficulties understanding and engaging with. And the older the collection is, the more difficult it is for people who are not trained to understand what all of this is about. On the other hand, you have the context focus, and you can tend to forget about the collection and be so concerned with the visitor, getting them into having a wonderful experience, that you tend to forget, that you actually have a collection. And so in order to juggle those two visions, if you like, I like to just draw on the Moesgaard Museum, as you can see in the circle here, which is a cultural history museum that we have worked with. Many of the museums we've worked with over the years have either begun to build completely new museums, or they have constructed new wings or refurbished their permanent exhibitions. And all of this, of course, give museums an opportunity to rework who are we for, what are we here for, and so on and so forth. And how did the Moesgaard Museum tackle that challenge? So this is to the left, the new building. It's like a kind of, if you think about Nordic mythology, it's a kind of if you think about a kind of thing, the kind of underworld coming up. It's kind of, you just dug up a little thing here, and you see the museum rising. It's grass, you can't really see this, but it's grass on the roof, so people can have picnics in the summer, they can ski in the winter. And the main attraction of this particular museums are bog people who've been preserved in bogs. You probably have some of them also here in this country. Anyway, so everybody comes to see the bog people. Another kind of main attraction of this particular museum is Viking collections from big battles. So you have loads and loads of shields and axes and whatnot in their hundreds and thousands. And so what did they do in order to juggle those two visions of what a museum is? You can't really see here, but here you see three images of three people, and then you have some physical objects below the three images. So what they did is they chose a narrative, they chose to make connection through a narrative. So they somehow have a narrative trail through the exhibition. So it's not that they forget they have an exhibition, but they say people don't understand objects, they understand people. And so we need to start with people. So they animate who could these people be who have used these particular objects. So when you enter a section of the museum, you can choose one of three characters, if you like, and then you follow that character through the exhibition. So and then at certain spots you hear what this character has to tell, and so the objects come to life in a sense. And this has proved to be very, very appealing to young and old alike, because you can engage people who do not have a prior understanding of the bog people or the Viking battles or something. And you can also engage both genders, because what they found in the past was that it could be quite difficult to engage many women in the kind of battle discourse that they were having. But now you have these possibilities of nuancing the narratives. So one of the narratives is also waiting for battle. And what do you do? I mean, the battle is a small thing. It's a very little event in a very large time frame. So this is one of the ways in which they have tried to handle this balance, if you like. Last but not least, I think it's very important to think about how some of these new networks that are necessary to develop museums, how can they come into being? Because it's very obvious that at least in many parts of Europe, the purely public funding of museums are often insufficient, particularly in an age of austerity, to begin to develop what many museums want to develop. So often you see a kind of patchwork of funding schemes with third sector, with big private donors and so on and so forth. And I think the situation in Europe here is a bit different from we know from the US, where federal money is really a very small part, but private donations is really what keep museums going, right? But at least from a European perspective, I think this kind of patchwork economy is what we'll be seeing more and more. And so I think it's very important for museum professionals and those of us who are lucky enough to work with museums to understand what it takes to generate those kinds of networks. And I think this was also demonstrated in the wonderful presentations we had this morning, that first and foremost you need a clear vision about what your museum is and why are we in the world? Who are we for? And this sounds very easy it's very easy to ask. It's not always very easy to answer. And once you have that vision, which is not easy, then you have to have very visible leadership to steer this vision, also when it becomes difficult, because as in all organizations, you have a complexity of professional types of expertise, and you need visible leadership in order to steer the vision when it becomes turned into practice. Then I think it's also very important to harness a diversity of competences and to have, as I say here, updated knowledge exchange through partnerships. And that can be partnerships inside the museum, but also very importantly, partnerships beyond the museum. One of the areas that I have found very fertile is the partnership between universities and the museum world, because we have seen over the last 10-15 years a number of wonderful experiments with new forms of interaction, new forms of participation, but we know very little about what works, why it works, in a more systematic sense. Often we resort to kind of very crude visitor studies, interpretations of what happens before you go in, what happens after you leave the museum. We need much more systematic knowledge to close the knowledge gap between practice and research here. So not just museum research and heritage research in terms of archaeology and art history, that is important, but it's also important to have a bridge in terms of understanding engagement and dissemination. Then internally, connections within the museum, a coherent organization across creation, communication and learning. Again, seen from a museum perspective, my collaboration with a number of museums have taught me over the years that this is no mean feat, because often you have museums being very compartmentalized, and it can be difficult if you want to have if you want to develop new visions to then do it with respect to harnessing all the resources and the interlacing where the action is and where the new ideas often germinate. Let me finish by a wish for what we still don't know about the Ulysses Centre. We're really keen to hear more about this. I mean, because I said to Margaret, but I don't know, I'm speaking into the void here. I don't know what your Ulysses Centre will be. And Margaret said, I won't tell you, but we will hear this afternoon, late this afternoon. But anyway, if I understand it correctly, it is about the wonderful, particularly specific heritage that you've got with these wonderful Irish writers that, I mean, I have English as an MA, so I read not all of them, but many of them. And so of course the Ulysses Centre will be about literature, it'll be about books, it'll be about wonderful creative geniuses. But as a media historian, which I was by training, let me also say that reading is also about writing. And writing is perhaps going back to what I said earlier about engagement with the outside community. Writing is where one can find a voice. Reading is to if we read, we can receive what others have written, but we cannot have a voice of our own through reading. We can have a voice of our own through writing. So I would very much hope that in the spirit of what I've said today, that you'll remember that reading and writing goes together. And it would be wonderful if you could use the opportunity with the Ulysses Centre to also remember that the founding fathers of most modern schools in Europe had big discussions about whether or not to teach peasant children to also write. They were very adamant to have them read, because then you could read the Bible, and that was important. So that money well spent. But was it also a good thing to have children learn to write? Because if you can write, you can have a voice of your own, and you can express yourself, and you can share that expression with others. And that's dangerous. So anyway, that was when modernity was founded, and that's kind of part of our legacy in terms of democratic societies. So I think you have a wonderful opportunity celebrating also the Easter Rising of 1916 to think about the duality and the commonalities with reading and writing. So thank you.